Good evening, I'm Saraya Mia. Malaysia eyes tariff relief below 10% in upcoming U.S. talks. And China says it will honor latest trade deal with Washington. All this and more coming up on AWANI International. Malaysia will push for lower tariff rates on key sectors following the U.S.'s 10% baseline tariff, particularly those deemed strategic to both economies. This comes ahead of another round of negotiations with Washington on June 18th. Investment, Trade and Industry Minister Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Abdul Aziz said the talks aim to secure fairer terms for Malaysian exporters. He added that Malaysia remains committed to engaging constructively with the U.S. government. However, he did not specify which sectors were under negotiation. The June 18th mission follows an earlier high-level visit by Zafrul on April 24th, during which he held talks with U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and other senior U.S. officials. The U.S. currently imposes a 24% tariff on certain Malaysian exports. Implementation on these tariffs have been temporarily paused for 90 days to allow room for negotiations.
The negotiation is basically to make sure that, as you know, there is a floor that they ever said that looks like non-negotiable, which is the 10%. Malaysia has been imposed a tariff of 24%. So, of course, the first target is to reduce that. Second target is there are sectors that we feel should be even going below that 10%. So maybe we have to look at those sectors carefully. Sectors that are important for Malaysian exporters and sectors that are also important for the U.S. economy.
Meanwhile, China says it will always honor its commitment after U.S. President Donald Trump declared that a trade deal with Beijing is done. The Chinese Foreign Ministry on Thursday expresses hope that the U.S. will work together with China to carry out what both presidents agreed on. The announcement follows 2 days of intense talks in London aimed at easing tensions after months of escalating tariffs between the world's two largest economies. Trump said China had agreed to supply U.S. companies with magnets and rare earth minerals, while the U.S. will step back from the threats to revoke visas of Chinese students, adding that U.S. tariffs will be set at 55% and China's at 10%. This is subject to final approval from the two presidents, says Trump. Details of the latest agreement remain limited, but officials say the agreement does not change the broader term of the Geneva deal, which scaled back but did not remove new tariffs sparked by Trump's trade war earlier this year. Trump and China's leader, Xi Jinping, spoke over the phone last week to kickstart the negotiations, which involved top officials from both countries. We'll be right back after the break.
Kelima mau datang lagi? Mungkin shampoo anda tidak 100%. Mari kita lihat. Gunalah Head & Shoulders menghilangkan kelimomo sehingga 100%, membasmi kegagalan, melindungi kulit kepala sehingga 48 jam supaya kelimomo dan kegagalan tidak datang lagi. Head & Shoulders.
Welcome back. U.S. President Donald Trump says he's willing to extend the July 8th deadline for completing trade talks with countries before higher U.S. tariffs kick in. However, he believes it would not be necessary.
Would you be willing to extend the deadline for trade talks with these countries?
I would, but I don't think we're going to have that necessity. We made a great deal with China. We're very happy with it. We have everything we need, and we're going to do very well with it, and hopefully they are too.
Trump said trade talks were ongoing with some 15 countries, including South Korea, Japan, and the European Union. He added that letters outlining trade terms will be sent out in the coming weeks to dozens more nations, which they can choose to accept or reject. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier said that the administration may extend the deadline or roll the date forward for countries negotiating in good faith. The current 90-day pause on Trump's reciprocal tariffs ends July 8th, with only one trade deal agreed with Britain and 17 others still at various stages of negotiation. A separate deal with China, agreed on Tuesday in London to de-escalate their trade war, is moving on a different timeline, with an August 10th deadline.
Protests have spread across the U.S. following days of demonstrations in Los Angeles, which remains under curfew for a second night. Activists have reportedly gathered in over 25 cities, rebuking the Trump administration's immigration raids.
In Seattle, hundreds of protesters marched towards federal buildings downtown, with some waving signs welcoming immigrants and denouncing the immigration or ICE. Meanwhile, police in Las Vegas issued a dispersal order after demonstrators gathered near an ICE office. Thousands of protesters also gathered in Lower Manhattan of New York, with 34 people later arrested and charged. A further 52 people were detained and issued with court summons after the largely peaceful protests. Earlier on Wednesday evening, police officers on foot and on horseback in Los Angeles forced crowds to disperse by firing flashbangs and foam rounds after the overnight curfew began. Nearly 400 people have been arrested in Los Angeles since the protests began on Friday, including 330 undocumented migrants and 157 detained for assault and obstruction. A total of 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines have been deployed to quell the unrest, with some of them now authorized to detain people until police can arrest them.
The U.S. has launched a review of its submarine deal with the UK and Australia, citing the need to align it with its America First agenda. The move follows growing pressure from the White House for both allies to increase their military spending.
Washington is urging partners to spend at least 3% of GDP on defense as soon as possible. The UK has pledged to raise defense spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2028, while Australia has said it would lift funding but not to the level that the US is seeking. Both Australia and the UK have downplayed news of the US probe, saying it was natural for a new administration to reassess. The AUKUS agreement, worth $239 billion, was signed in 2021 when all three countries were led by different people. Under the Trilateral Security Pact, Australia is set to receive its first nuclear-powered submarines from the US. The alliance has drawn repeated criticism from China, with Beijing warning that it could trigger a regional arms race and undermine stability in the Indo-Pacific.
Meanwhile, Iran says a nuclear agreement with the U.S. is within reach and could be achieved quickly. The two sides are due for a sixth round of indirect talks on Sunday in Muscat, Oman.
The remark was made by Foreign Minister Said Abbas Araghchi on social media platform X on Wednesday. He stressed that any deal would depend on two conditions: the continuation of Iran's uranium enrichment under full supervision by the International Atomic Energy Agency and the effective lifting of sanctions. Meanwhile, Iran's Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh warned that if talks collapse and conflict erupts, U.S. military bases across the Middle East, all within Iran's striking range, would be targeted. Since April, Iran and the US have held 5 rounds of indirect talks mediated by Oman, 3 in Muscat and 2 in Rome, focusing on Iran's nuclear program and potential sanctions relief. The US has consistently pushed for a complete halt to Iran's enrichment activities, a demand that Iran firmly rejects.
The U.S. has ordered the departure of non-essential embassy staff and their families from the Middle East. President Donald Trump said American personnel are being moved out of the region amid heightened security concerns.
The US is partially evacuating its embassy in Iraq and allowing dependents to leave posts in Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. However, the US embassy in Bahrain said it continues to operate as usual despite Washington's orders. The decision comes amid a deadlock in nuclear talks between the US and Iran, with Trump saying he is less confident the two sides will reach a deal. It also follows reports that Israel is preparing to launch an attack on Iran in the near future.
Shares of plane maker Boeing fell nearly 8% in pre-market U.S. trading on Thursday after an Air India aircraft with 242 people on board crashed minutes after taking off from India's western city of Ahmedabad. Authorities have recovered at least 30 bodies, but the death toll is expected to rise. The plane was headed for Gatwick Airport and had crashed in a civilian area nearby. It is not immediately clear what caused the crash, but Boeing said it's aware of initial reports and is working to gather more information. The incident comes as the plane maker tries to rebuild trust related to safety in its jets and ramp up production. It has also been facing headwinds over the past months from U.S.-China trade tensions, which have disputed deliveries and increased supply chain costs. In early April, Boeing shares fell roughly 3% amid concerns over U.S. trade tariffs on steel and aluminum and retaliatory actions from China affecting aircraft deliveries. Starting June 12, Indonesian travelers will be eligible for China's 240-hour visa-free transit policy. This brings the total number of participating countries to 55.
According to the National Immigration Administration, the visa allows eligible travelers with valid documents and a confirmed onward ticket to a third destination to transit through China for up to 240 hours or 10 days without a visa. It also permits people to engage in tourism and business. China's visa-free transit policy applies to 60 designated entry points across 24 regions, including major cities like Beijing and Shanghai. The move aims to enhance international travel and promote cross-border exchanges.
Israel's parliament has rejected a preliminary vote to dissolve itself after a breakthrough in a dispute over military conscription. The motion, which could have triggered early elections that polls suggest Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would lose, failed by a vote of 61 to 53.
With 120 seats in the Knesset, 61 votes were needed to pass. The result gives Netanyahu's coalition more time to resolve its worst political crisis and avoid elections, the first since the Gaza war began. Netanyahu has been pushing to resolve a deadlock in his coalition over a new conscription bill that would exempt ultra-Orthodox Jews from military service, a move that has divided Israelis. While most Israelis are required to serve nearly 3 years in the military and remain on reserve duty, the ultra-Orthodox, which make up 13% of the population, have long been exempted for religious purposes. The issue has stoked tensions between secular and religious Israelis, especially since the Gaza conflict, which has placed a heavier burden on soldiers. Frustrated with the impasse, ultra-Orthodox factions in Netanyahu's coalition have threatened to back opposition calls to dissolve parliament, bringing forward an election that is not due until late 2026.
The number of people displaced by war and persecution worldwide has risen to over 122 million this year. The United Nations Refugee Agency says this is due to a failure to resolve multi-year conflicts, such as those in Ukraine and Sudan.
There were over 2 million more people displaced globally by the end of April 2025 compared to the previous year. This is despite the return of nearly the same number of Syrians following the collapse of Bashar al-Assad. The surge in displacement comes as funding to support them has fallen to levels last seen in 2015, when the total number of refugees worldwide was around half of what it is today. The UNHCR described the aid cuts as brutal and ongoing, adding that the situation is leaving refugees and many others increasingly vulnerable. The agency, whose largest donor has historically been the US, previously warned that these cuts put millions of lives at risk, leaving women refugees more exposed to sexual violence and children at greater risk of trafficking.
That report wraps up AWANI International tonight. Stay tuned for our reports on the rivalries, strategies, and the shifts behind the power affairs driving the new global order. Visit international.astroawani.com for more. Be sure to follow our social media accounts at Power Affairs. That's all from me for the final time here at Astro AWANI. Thank you for the trust, the memories, and for letting me be part of your evening news for the past years. I'm Saraya Mia, signing off for the last time.